The sons shook hands on it in the machine shed, pleased with themselves, and neither of them looked twice at the man they'd just hired. "He'll do," Cade Ketch said to his brother after the hand had gone back out to the lot. "Works cheap, no family, no demands, asked for no days off. Can you believe that? We modernize the books, run him hard through calving. And if he doesn't work out, we cut him loose in spring. No harm done." Brent nodded, already back on his phone, already on to the next efficiency. Out in the lot, the new hand, Gideon Rourke, one duffel bag, gray at the temples, quiet as a closed door, was standing very still among the heifers, doing the one thing neither brother had noticed him do in the whole interview, which was watch. He wasn't looking at the fences or the equipment the sons were so proud of. He was looking at the animals, one at a time, the way a man reads faces in a crowd for the one that's about to faint. Because what the Ketch sons did not know, what they had not looked closely enough to find, because they'd stopped looking closely at anything on that farm years ago, was that the cheap quiet hand they just hired to muck their lots had once run the largest cow-calf operation in the state, and that he'd walked away from all of it and never said the reason to a living soul. Gideon was 58 and had arrived that fall the way he'd arrived at a dozen farms over a dozen years, with one bag, no history, and a willingness to do the work nobody wanted. He never mentioned his past, because his past was a thing he carried the way you carry a stone in your boot, on purpose as penance. The Ketch place suited him. Old Silas Ketch, the father, was in his 80s and mostly to the house now, sharp in the eyes but done in the body, and his two sons had taken over with the enthusiasm of men who'd read about farming more than they'd done it. They'd hired Gideon to run the cattle end while they modernized, new software, new equipment, a plan to thin the herd and lean the operation the way a spreadsheet likes. They saw a herd as a line item. Gideon saw 400 living animals, each one telling him something, and he'd known within a week that the Ketch cattle were being managed by men who had stopped paying attention. He knew what that cost. He'd learned it the hardest way a man can. Gideon Rourke had been once the best stockman anyone in 3 counties had ever seen, and he'd built an operation to match, 1,000 head, his own ground, a name people said with respect. He'd learned it all from his father, a plain cattleman named Ross Rourke, who'd raised his son in the calving barn and taught him the thing that was worth more than all the acres Gideon later bought. Trouble whispers before it shouts, "Son, a sick animal, a bad fence, a storm. It tells you quiet, first, every time. The whole job is staying close enough to hear the whisper." Ross had said it 1,000 times, and Gideon had lived by it and prospered by it until the year he got too big to hear it. He'd scaled the operation past what one man could keep his eyes on, hired managers, trusted screens and reports instead of his own 2 feet in the pens. And one brutal calving season, stretched thin, stretched everywhere at once. No longer close enough to hear anything whisper, he'd missed it. A scours outbreak that started as one dull-eyed calf he never saw, because he was in an office, because he'd stopped walking the pens at night the way his father taught him. By the time it shouted it, had ripped through the whole calf crop. He lost most of a year's calves in 3 weeks. And in the worst of it, exhausted, not sleeping, not seeing straight, he'd made the second mistake. A heat lamp left too close to bedding in a barn he was too tired to check twice. And the barn fire that followed took the rest, and took his wife Della, who'd gone in to try to turn the animals out. He'd stopped hearing the whisper, and it had cost him everything. And he blamed no weather, and no market, and no hired manager. He blamed the man who'd gotten too big to pay attention. He sold what was left, paid what he owed, and walked away from his own name. And he'd spent the years since as anonymous hired labor, working small herds the only way he'd let himself work now. Close, quiet, one head at a time, listening for the whisper he'd once been too important to hear. The one thing he'd carried out of the fire was a worn leather calving book, his father's and then his own, singed dark along one edge. every animal he'd ever kept recorded in it in a careful hand. He wrote in it still. The Ketch sons, when they saw him writing in it in the evenings, assumed it was a diary and didn't ask. It went in his jacket every morning. It was the whole of what he had left. The doubter was the older son, Cade, who wanted the herd gone. Cade had a plan to sell most of the cattle and put the ground to grain, which was easier and cleaner and looked better on the software. And he saw Gideon's slow, careful stockmanship as exactly the old-fashioned inefficiency he meant to modernize away. "I don't need you babying every heifer in the lot," Cade told him one evening. "Finding Gideon out among the close-up cows after dark with a flashlight. We've got monitors for that now. Half these old cows I'm selling in the spring anyway. You're on the clock, Rourke. I'm not paying you to walk around in the dark talking to livestock. There's 3 heifers close." Gideon said quietly, "One of them's going to have trouble. She's carrying wrong. I like to be near when they're close." Cade laughed. The app didn't flag anything. He shook his head and went back to the house, certain the quiet hand was earning his cheap wage by wasting time in the dark. Gideon stood a while longer among the cattle and said his father's line to himself under his breath, the way he did every night now, penance and prayer at once. Trouble whispers before it shouts. Stay close enough to hear it. Then he checked the 3 close-up heifers one more time and went to his cot in the bunk room and did not sleep well, because one of them had told him something he didn't like. The morning that changed everything came in the 2nd week of March, and it came the way the worst of it always comes, early and hard. And at the thing that couldn't defend itself. A spring blizzard blew up overnight, the killing kind wet heavy snow, and a wind that drove the cold straight through, and it hit in the dead middle of calving. The Ketch sons woke to a whiteout, and a herd of cows dropping calves into a storm that would kill a wet newborn in 20 minutes, and they had no idea what to do. Cade's monitors were useless in it. The software couldn't pull a calf or warm one. Brent stood in the shed door looking at a lot full of laboring cows and dying calves, and the plain fact that he and his brother, for all their modernizing, did not know how to save them. Old Silas got as far as the porch and could go no farther. They were about to lose the calf crop that was the whole year, and they knew it, and they were helpless. Gideon was already out in it. He'd been out since 3, because the whisper he'd heard the week before had told him this was coming, and he'd stayed close. And what the Ketch sons saw, when they finally waded out into the storm, was the cheap, quiet hand they'd overlooked all winter doing the thing he'd been the best in the state at, before they were born to it. Gideon moved through that blizzard like a man half his age and twice as sure, finding the newborns in the drifts before they chilled, drying them, running them into the warm shed one after another, catching the cows in trouble by the way they stood, by the whisper. He got the difficult heifer, the one the app never flagged, the one he'd told Kate about. She was down and calving wrong. The calf turned, and Gideon was on his knees in the snow, with his coat off and his arm inside her, turning the calf the way his father taught him. Calm as still water while the storm screamed, and he brought that calf out alive and breathing when no monitor and no spreadsheet on earth could have. He worked through the whole white morning without stopping, and when the storm broke near noon, the Ketch place had lost. Out of a calf crop the sons had been sure was gone. Almost nothing. Because one man had stayed close enough to hear it coming and known exactly what to do when it did. Cade Ketch stood in the shed among 24 warm living calves that would have been dead without the hand he'd mocked, and could not find a word. The past came out the way it does, sideways that same afternoon. The large animal veterinarian finally made it through the drifts, an older man who'd driven the region 40 years, and he came into the warm shed and looked at the calves saved, and the heifer pulled, and the quiet man washing up in the corner, and he stopped cold. "Gideon?" the vet said. "Gideon Rourke?" He turned to the sons, disbelieving. "Do you boys know who's been running your cattle? This is Gideon Rourke. He had the biggest cow-calf outfit in the state. Best stockman I ever stood beside. I worked his herd 20 years ago. I thought, after the fire, everyone thought you'd left the country." He looked at Gideon with something close to grief. "You've been out here mucking lots?" The shed was very quiet. Cade Ketch looked at the hired hand he'd threatened to fire, the man he'd been paying cheap to waste time in the dark talking to livestock, and understood, all at once, everything he had not bothered to see. There was no gloating in it, because gloating was the last thing left in Gideon Rourke. He dried his hands and picked up his singed calving book off the rail. "I don't run outfits anymore," he told the vet. "Quiet. I just keep close to the ones in front of me. It's all I'm good for now. And to the sons, plain, no barb in it. You'll lose the rest of these cows if you sell them off and manage the herd from a screen. They talk. You have to be near enough to be told. That's the whole of it. That's all I know." The reckoning was the gentle kind this niche is built for, because the doubters were family and the story wasn't about breaking them. Cade Ketch, who'd planned to sell the herd and lean the operation and modernize the old man's life work into a spreadsheet, sat with his father Silas that night and heard, maybe for the first time, what the herd had meant and what it had nearly cost to stop paying attention to it. He didn't sell the cattle. He asked Gideon instead to teach him and his brother how to actually see them, how to walk the pens at night, how to hear the whisper. And Gideon, who had spent 12 years believing his knowledge was only good for penance, found there was a use for it after all, which was to keep two young men from ever making his mistake. Old Silas Ketch was the one who reached furthest. He'd known who Gideon was for weeks, it turned out. An old cattleman recognizes another, and Silas had said nothing, waiting to see if his sons had eyes. After the storm, he made Gideon an offer, and it wasn't a hand's wage. He offered him a share, a real stake, a place to stop drifting, to run the Ketch cattle as his own and rebuild. On someone else's ground, the thing he'd lost on his. A man that good with an animal shouldn't be hiding in a bunk room, Silas said. "I've got a herd and no sons that can hear it. You've got the hearing and no herd. That's not a tragedy. That's a fit." Gideon didn't answer for a long time. Then he took his father's calving book out of his jacket and set it on the table, the singed old thing, and opened it, and started a new page with the Ketch herd's numbers at the top. And that was his answer. The good spread the way it does. The Ketch cattle came through the rest of that calving better than they had in a decade. And the two sons learned to farm with their feet and not just their phones. And word got around that the finest stockman in the state hadn't left the country after all. He was over at the Ketch place, and he'd teach anyone who'd walk the pens at night to learn. Young farmers started coming to him, and Gideon, who had spent 12 years alone with a stone in his boot, found that giving the whisper away to people who wanted it was the only thing that had ever made the stone lighter. He never got the old operation back, and never wanted it. A man who's learned the cost of getting too big to see doesn't reach for big again. He kept the Ketch herd close and known, one head at a time, the size a man can actually hear. And some nights, walking the close-up cows in the dark with his flashlight and his father's book, checking one more time on the ones that were near, he'd say the line his father left him, the one he'd once gotten too important to obey and had spent his whole ruin learning to live by again. Trouble whispers before it shouts. Stay close enough to hear it. His sons had hired someone to run the farm, and never looked closely enough to see who they'd hired, which was the very sickness the man had come to cure. In them and in himself, both. Because the whole of it, the herd and the fire and the storm and the long years of penance, came down to one plain thing Ross Rourke had known, and his son had to lose everything to remember, that what gets overlooked is never the loud thing. It's the quiet thing, whispering, waiting for someone close enough, and paying enough attention to be told. If you've ever been overlooked by people who'd stopped paying attention and turned out to be exactly what they needed all along, tell us about it in the comments. We read them all. The moral is as plain as a calf saved from the snow. The most valuable things, in a herd or a farm or a person, don't announce themselves, they whisper. And they're missed by everyone too busy or too proud to stay close and listen. Pay attention to the quiet ones. The whole story is usually hiding in what everyone else stopped looking at. Tell us where you're listening from tonight. and about the person who taught you to hear the whisper before it became a shout. If this story reached you, share it with someone the world has overlooked, quietly doing the work no one's watching. And whatever you're tending right now, a herd, a farm, a family, your own bruised self, may you stay close enough to hear the whisper, humble enough to keep listening, and blessed, one hard morning, to be exactly the one who knew what to do when it finally shouted.